The first thing I noticed was how still the office had become. Not the kind of still you get on a Sunday morning, when the building breathes easy and the cleaning crew leaves everything smelling like lemon and floor wax. This was a different kind of still, the kind that settles in right after someone says something they can't take back. I had just turned 63 that March, 31 years in supply chain logistics. 19 of those years with Hargrove Northern Distribution, a mid-size freight and warehousing company out of Mississauga, Ontario, that moved industrial equipment parts across 6 provinces. I knew that company the way a surgeon knows an operating table. Every system, every quirk, every workaround that nobody had bothered to document because I was always just there to fix it. My name is Gerald Bouchard, and I want to tell you exactly what happened the week I was told my experience no longer had value and what happened 11 days later when they found out just how wrong they were. I had built the carrier compliance tracking system at Hargrove Northern from scratch. Not from a template, not from software. A consultant sold them. From scratch, back in 2009, when the company was bleeding money on late deliveries and customs delays because nobody had a reliable way to track which carriers were certified for cross-provincial hazardous material transport. I spent 4 months designing the database, writing the protocols, and training the team. After that, penalties dropped by 68% in the first year alone. That system became the spine of the company's operations. Every contract renewal, every provincial audit, every carrier onboarding, it all ran through what I had built and continued to maintain. My direct supervisor for the last 11 years was a man I'll call my manager, Douglas. Good man, straight shooter. He and I had the kind of working relationship where we didn't need to say much, we just understood how things needed to run. He retired in the autumn before all of this happened, and that was when the trouble started. Not because Douglas left, but because of who they brought in to replace him. My new manager arrived in November. She was the director's nephew's wife, and I only mention that because it became relevant later. She was 34 years old, had a supply chain management certificate from an online program, and had previously worked in retail inventory for a furniture chain in Brampton. She was pleasant enough in the first few weeks. Asked questions, took notes, nodded a lot. By February, she had stopped asking questions. By March, she had started making decisions. The first one that affected me directly came on a Tuesday afternoon. She called me into the small boardroom on the second floor, the one with the broken blind that nobody had fixed in 2 years, and she told me that she had been reviewing team structures with the director, and they felt there was an opportunity to streamline. I asked her what that meant. She said they were bringing in a software platform. A vendor out of Calgary had pitched them a carrier compliance management tool that would automate most of what I did manually. She said the transition would begin in 60 days. She said my role would be restructured. She handed me a document. I looked at the document. My new role was described as administrative support logistics data entry. The salary was listed. It was 31% lower than what I was currently earning. I looked up at her. I said, with as much calm as I could hold, "So you're telling me that after 19 years of building and running the system that this company depends on, you want me to enter data at a junior rate?" She said the decision had been made above her. She said she was sorry. She said the software would handle the complex work now. I nodded once. I told her I needed to think about it. She said I had until the end of the week. I went back to my desk. I did not say anything to anyone. I pulled up the compliance database, and I looked at it for a long time. Not with anger, just with the quiet understanding of someone who has watched a room full of people make a decision without understanding what they were actually deciding. The software they had chosen was called VeraTrack Pro. I had seen the demo. The vendor's sales team had done a sharp presentation, clean interface, automated alerts, integration with Transport Canada's carrier registry. It looked impressive. And for a company moving standard retail freight, it probably would have been fine. Hargrove Northern was not moving standard retail freight. Roughly 40% of our carrier network operated under special permits for oversized industrial loads, and a subset of that worked with Class 7 and Class 8 restricted materials. The compliance rules for those carriers changed constantly: provincial regulation updates, federal harmonization amendments, insurance threshold changes that varied by cargo type and route. I tracked all of that manually, because the rules didn't exist in any standardized database that an automated tool could reliably pull from. I had spent years building relationships with compliance officers in 3 provincial ministries. I had a binder, an actual physical binder of contacts and notes that existed nowhere else. VeraTrack Pro didn't know any of that. It couldn't. It was built for a different kind of operation. But nobody had asked me whether the tool was suitable. They had asked the vendor, who said yes, and the director, who said great. And that was apparently enough. I took the weekend to think. On Monday morning, I submitted a formal memo to my new manager and copied the director. I laid out, as clearly and without emotion as I could, 7 specific compliance scenarios that VeraTrack Pro would not be able to handle based on its documented capabilities. I included references to the relevant regulations. I asked for a meeting to discuss. I did not get a meeting. I got an email 3 days later saying my concerns had been noted and that the transition would proceed as planned. It was 4 sentences long. I went home that evening and I told my wife what had happened. She listened. She said, "Gerald, you've given that company nearly 2 decades. If they won't listen to you now, maybe it's time to let them find out on their own." She was right. I've learned over 63 years that the most expensive lesson is the one people refuse to learn any other way. I submitted my resignation the following Monday. I gave them 6 weeks' notice, more than I was required to give, because I am not the kind of person who leaves a job half-finished. I offered, in writing, to document every process, every contact, every exception protocol I had developed. I offered to be available for consultation during the VeraTrack implementation. My new manager thanked me and said she would let me know. She never let me know. I spent my last 6 weeks doing my job exactly as I always had. I documented what I could in the time I had. I sent follow-up emails asking whether anyone wanted to go through the exception protocols with me. I got no responses. On my last Friday, a few colleagues took me for lunch at the Greek place on Dundas. Someone brought a cake. I drove home with a box of desk items and a card that everyone had signed. That night, my wife made roast chicken, and we sat on the back porch even though it was still cold. She held my hand and said, "You did everything right." I said, "I know," and I meant it. I want to stop here for a moment, because what I'm about to describe is not something I went looking for. I did not set out to prove anyone wrong. I did not make plans. I did not keep files strategically or position myself for leverage. I had genuinely moved on. I was talking to a former colleague about contract consulting work. I was sleeping better than I had in years. I was not waiting for anything. What happened next happened on its own. It was 11 days after my last day at Hargrove Northern. I was at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and my laptop, reading an industry newsletter, when my phone rang. The number was the company's main line. I almost didn't answer. I picked up on the 4th ring. It was the director himself, not my former manager. The director. He had never once called me directly in 19 years. His assistant had always made contact when he needed something. He said, "Gerald, I'm going to be straightforward with you. We have a situation." I said, "All right." He said that VeraTrack Pro had gone live 4 days earlier. He said that over the weekend, the system had flagged 32 carriers as compliant, that my records showed as suspended or conditionally approved pending reinspection. He said 3 of those carriers had already been dispatched on active routes. He said one of them was carrying Class 7 materials through the Alberta-Saskatchewan corridor under a permit that had actually lapsed the previous October. He paused. I waited. He said, "We need someone who understands the actual compliance picture for these carriers. We need it by Wednesday morning, or we are looking at regulatory exposure that I don't want to describe to you over the phone." I said, "I understand the situation." He said, "I know this is not how we should be having this conversation. I know that." He said it carefully, the way men say things when they know they have made a serious mistake and are only now understanding the full size of it. I asked him what exactly he was proposing. He said he wanted to bring me back in, on a consulting basis, to audit the active carrier file and identify any compliance gaps before the Wednesday morning departure window for their largest weekly freight run. He mentioned a figure. It was a fair figure. I'll say that. He was not trying to get something for nothing. I told him I would call him back within the hour. I poured another cup of coffee. I sat at the kitchen table, and I thought about those 32 carriers. I thought about the Class 7 shipment moving through Saskatchewan. I thought about the crew on that truck, who had nothing to do with any of this, who had just taken a job and were doing their work and had no idea that the paperwork behind them had a hole in it. I called the director back. I said I would do it. I said I needed full remote access to the carrier database restored by end of day, and I needed someone from operations available to take calls if I had questions about dispatch scheduling. He said done. I also said, and I said it plainly, without hostility, I said, I want to be clear that this engagement is for the immediate audit only. I'm not coming back in any other capacity, and I'd like the consulting agreement in writing before I start. He said, of course, absolutely. The agreement came through by 3 in the afternoon. I started at 4. I worked through that evening and most of Tuesday. My wife brought me dinner at my desk. I pulled up the carrier records one by one, not through VeraTrack, but through the original database I had built, which was still live on the company server, and which, apparently, nobody had thought to decommission. Every note I had ever entered was still there. Every flag, every contact name, every exception I had logged over 19 years. VeraTrack had pulled its compliance data from Transport Canada's public registry, which is updated on a quarterly basis and reflects the official status of carrier certifications. What it did not reflect were the informal holds carriers who were technically still registered but whose field performance or insurance situations had put them on our internal watch list, pending formal review. That watch list existed only in my database. It had never been migrated. Nobody had migrated it because nobody had known it needed to be migrated, or they had known and decided not to bother. By Tuesday evening, I had gone through the full active carrier file. I had flagged 11 carriers that required immediate action, 2 who needed to be pulled from active routes before Wednesday morning, and 9 who needed formal reevaluation before their next dispatch. I wrote a clear, organized report. I included the specific regulation references for each case. I noted what steps operations would need to take and in what order. I sent it to the director at 9:47 p.m. He replied at 10:12 p.m. He said, Gerald, this is exactly what we needed. Thank you. That was it. That was all he said. I closed my laptop and sat in the kitchen for a while. The house was quiet. My wife was asleep. The dog was asleep at my feet. Outside, the March snow was coming down in that soft, steady way that makes everything look calm. I thought about the 31 years I had spent building knowledge that lived, mostly, inside my head and inside systems I had created. I thought about how easily that knowledge had been dismissed, not with malice, exactly, but with the casual certainty of people who had never had to depend on it. I thought about the carrier on the Saskatchewan highway and the fact that they would get where they were going safely because someone had caught the gap in time. I felt something I didn't expect to feel. Not vindication, not satisfaction in the way I might have predicted, something quieter, more like clarity. The consulting invoice was paid within the week. No disputes, no delays. A few weeks after that, I got a message from a former colleague, not anyone in management, just someone I had worked with for years in operations. She said, just so you know, VeraTrack has been scaled back significantly. They're keeping it for standard carriers only. Someone rebuilt a version of your exception database. It's not as good, but they're trying. I thanked her for letting me know. I did not respond to the company beyond that. The director did not call again. My former manager did not reach out. I don't know what happened to them, and I don't spend time wondering. What I do think about what I've been turning over in my mind since this whole thing resolved is what this situation teaches. Not just about logistics or software or corporate decision-making, though there are lessons there too. About something more fundamental. There is a particular kind of mistake that organizations make, and individuals make, when they confuse documentation with knowledge. A database, a software platform, a procedure manual. These things capture what was true at a specific moment. They do not capture the judgment required to know when the rules have changed, when an exception applies, when the thing that looks compliant on paper is actually a liability waiting to move down a highway. That kind of knowledge is built over time, through relationships, through showing up, through making mistakes, and learning from them, and then being around long enough to remember what you learned. It cannot be purchased from a vendor in Calgary. It cannot be replicated by someone who has been in the role for 4 months. This is true in logistics. It is true in accounting, in healthcare, in law, in every field where experience is not just a credential, but a living, working asset. The people who carry that knowledge are not always the most visible people in a room. They are often not the loudest or the most persuasive or the most comfortable with presentations. They are the people who have simply stayed and learned and kept showing up. When an organization loses those people carelessly without asking what they know, without making any real effort to understand what will leave with them, the organization does not immediately know what it has lost. It finds out later. Sometimes in small ways, sometimes in ways that are serious enough to make a director call someone's personal phone at 9 in the morning and speak very carefully. To anyone who is in a position similar to where I was, who has been told that your experience can be replaced by a tool, that your years of accumulated knowledge are an inefficiency rather than an asset, I want to say this as directly as I can: document everything, not as a weapon, not in anticipation of conflict, but as a practice of professional integrity. Keep your records. Know what you know and know why it matters. And do not allow someone else's inability to see your value to become your own doubt about it. And to anyone who is in a position of managing experienced people, who is considering restructuring a role, replacing a function with software, or streamlining someone's decades of institutional knowledge into a junior data entry position, I would ask you one question before you finalize that decision. Not, can the software do this? Ask instead, what does this person know that the software doesn't know? It doesn't know. The answer to that question, if you are honest about finding it, might save you a very expensive Wednesday morning. I am still consulting. The work suits me at this point in my life. I choose my clients. I set my hours. Last week, I was on a call with a mid-sized freight company in Hamilton that is trying to build a carrier compliance system from scratch. I spent 2 hours walking their operations manager through the framework I developed at Hargrove. He took notes the whole time. Before we hung up, he said, "You know, I don't think we could have figured this out without someone who had actually done it." I told him that was exactly right, and I meant it kindly.